Hi folks, with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about, it's an age-old discussion about who gets the right to vote, the structure and architecture of democracy. Is the right to vote a democracy, or is the right to vote tempered by, a republic? Is there proportional voting? Should there be a House of Review that's selected from a different part of society than the lower house or the People's Assembly? All these questions are questions that minds, the great minds, many of the great minds of history have wrestled with for thousands of years. And it's still a debate raging today, suggesting that maybe any perfection in that area is elusive, if not impossible, or that we yet to find it, and if so, what might it be? But I noticed, I was reading a history book that contained in it some of the correspondence between the people who would become the founding fathers of the United States shortly before the war, what was later to be called the War of Independence, broke out. Now there was already skirmishing, and there was some hot-headed pamphleteers that were out stirring up the crowds and so on. But there were various exchanges that were going between the likes of the Jeffersons and the John Adams, the James Madisons, a young Alexander Hamilton, and indeed others, about what form a democracy, given the then understanding of democracy, what form it should take, and particularly who should get the right to vote. Now, bear in mind, it was a very class-based society then. Not that it isn't heading back in that direction now, but it was a very class-based society. So they tended to see the hoi polloi and the riffraff as being, well, why should they have a right to vote? These people are illiterate; they barely know what day it is. They don't understand any of the political issues of the day. They can't read the newspapers or the pamphlets. They don't understand anything about the law or political process. So why should they get the right to vote? And should the selection of voters be different from the House of Review? For example, should the Senate or an upper house that reviews the legislation, the lower house, should that be only landowners? And if it's landowners, how much land should any plot of land do, or is it only the big landholders? Because Alexander Hamilton was, for example, concerned that if it was the bigger landowners, then they would become an entrenched aristocracy who would then lord it over the rest of the folks, be it the emerging intelligentsia or the upper middle class or whatever. So there were various attitudes to this. Who should have the right to vote and why, and indeed what power should that vote have? Should it be by district? Should there be electoral districts? Should there be an overall vote where everybody gets to vote? And all sorts of ideas are being bandied back and forth. Some, you can look at it now, seem to be very sensible. Others seem to be rather far-fetched. But nonetheless, it was people of goodwill. I'd like to point out something else, that as the British colonies sort of lurched towards conflict with authority, the authority being Britain, of course, at the time, they lurched towards conflict. There was a system of merit came in, and it wasn't perfect and it wasn't uniform or universal, but a system of merit came in. Suddenly they needed people who could get things done, who understood the issues, who could be learned on the key issues, and who could discuss them with knowledgeable authority and so on. So this created a form of meritocracy that really was unique in the world at the time. You saw flashes of it in the French Revolution that came a bit later, and the high quality generals that the revolution produced in France, that sort of thing. Then you would see there were sporadic bursts of it when England or Britain was threatened with invasion from the continent. They would suddenly turned to the more capable people most of the time, and that was in very much a class-based system. There was an emerging middle class of skilled people, like, for example, somebody who came from a very humble background, who had particular skill at cartography, drawing maps. They could be elevated to quite a senior position in the public service, based purely on skill. So, in relative to pretty much any other society at the time, England had a bent towards merit. That, while small and hardly uniform or universal, and didn't fully transcend the class system, still existed on a relative basis more than anyone else. And then you can look at another step up yet again in the early American colonies, where men of ability were able to rise to the top on that ability and on that merit. Alexander Hamilton again being one, but there were others. I mean, George Washington, for example, was not an educated man, nor would you classify him as any sort of intellectual, but he'd inherited sort of quite a decent sized holding of land, so he was a farmer or an agriculturalist, I guess you'd call it, of some consequence and some wealth. But he had gone to exceptional lengths to improve himself by reading the classics, by even to the point where he would get books from the upper classes in England on how to deport oneself in public and how to ride a horse sort of with an august, prestigious manner. And he'd gone to considerable lengths to effect an image of aristocratic deportment and so on. One that worked, by the way. So Washington was if you like, a self-improved guy. He busted his ass so he could play in the league that the intellectuals could. The guys like the Madisons and the Thomas Jefferson and those sort of people. Even a young Alexander Hamilton, who worked on Washington's staff when he was in his early 20s, and already you could see the signs of a rather exceptional individual in Hamilton that came from an unusual. I mean, he's a child of a Caribbean island, sort of small lot holding farm type thing, and he's no heavy hitter at all, and his family wasn't. And he was able, just on sheer ability and just brain power alone, to be able to elevate himself to be a national figure in the new American colonies. Now that sort of rising by merit was something that unusually brought some of the brightest people in the colonies, the American British colonies at the time, brought them to the forefront of drafting the Constitution. This is why there's an unusual amount of brain power in that Constitution. Guys like Madison and Jefferson and those, or other people at the time. Again, Hamilton. These were unusually bright, capable people who understood issues. John Adams, and that's an unusual sort of gathering of that much brain power. And it happened at that it happened in that point in history was. And in that situation, in those circumstances, was in itself very unusual in historical terms. There they were, and I've been to the Philadelphia Hall, the Liberty Bell, and all that sort of stuff, and walked around there, and I don't know, maybe it's my imagination, but I still got the vibe of those great men that gathered there to make these. Were momentous decisions, not simply for the United States, but they advanced the very concept of liberty and democracy. Now, whether they did it defensively or not, in the view of, well, the king has too much power, and we want to create another England that just has not so much power concentrated in a king, and has a better system of review, as in review of legislation, and has a wider pool of voters than England does. Because in England, I think only something like 10% of the population got to vote back in the day. This we're talking, the late 1700s now. Only 10% of them now. So they wanted to have a broader base of voters, not so much power in the king, and better systems of review, and constitutionally declared independent court. Now, Britain had a series of laws which, in aggregation, represent a constitution in form. But the framers of the American Constitution wanted to have, no, we want a document that explicitly says it and creates that architecture of how all things will subsequently be viewed. Now, it doesn't mean laws can't be changed, amendments can't be made, but that architecture of the checks and balances and so on is as valid today rather than it was then. But coming back to the voting, it's interesting looking at, nobody wanted the hoi polloi, the illiterate masses, to vote. They were considered simply too ill-informed. If they can't read, they are therefore ill-informed. And if they're ill-informed, they therefore should not have the vote. That was the sort of the general consensus. There wasn't really anyone that was pushing back against that or querying it. Now, and the same view could be held in say, anywhere anywhere in the world, really, at the time, that democracy was a system of government for the informed, and either you had to be literate or had to have engaged in some form of higher education or to improve your intellectual capability, if you like, or you had to own land or both. So those were the methods they used, just or not with hindsight, those are the methods they used to start separating who should vote and who should not vote, and who should decide their government. Now, given that the benchmark at the time, the most democratic place in the world was Britain, with it, give or take 10% of the population voting. That was to change, in the 1800s on, but then it was 10%. So any country that had 20%, for example, of the people voting, that was like a huge step forward and considered to be, whoa, that was very edgy in the democratic sort of how many people get to vote scheme of things. Then there's a division between, well, should majority rule? Should the 51 votes out of 100 decide, who gets to tell the other 49 what to do, or should it be tempered with a proportional representation through a more Republican sort of system of in the case of the Senate, where every territory gets a certain number of senators regardless of its population, so it's not tyranny by the majority. By the way, which the framers were very much aware of. They understood this tyranny of the majority thing. Now, I think some of that was, well, we don't want the hoi polloi getting the vote one day, and then they tell us, the landowners and the intelligentsia, what to do. I think that horrified them. But there was the idea of universal franchise, in effect, that everybody got the right to vote, universal, or every man got the right to vote. That was talked about, but it was never, as I understand, at least, never really put in place until much later on. Now, looking at the structure of voting, say in England in the 1880s, something like, I don't know, 65% thereabouts of or 80%. No, it wouldn't have been that much. Give or take, say 3/4 of the male population over the age of, I think it was 23 at the time, got the right to vote. That was another matter. When should somebody get the right to vote? Should it be 18? Should it be 21? Should it be 23? Bear in mind, life expectancy was much lower then. So, 23 seemed to be something a lot of countries sort of settled on. This assumption that someone who's done higher education should complete that first and then have the right to vote. Those were considerations, among others. So that was really the high point of 75% thereabouts of men had the right to vote. Now, the world was very different in 1880 than it was in 1780. There was because of Western wealth through industrialization, there was a vast middle class in 1880 that didn't exist in 1780. So there was some, democratic and wealth distribution differences that need to be considered here. But it was really World War I and World War II, the mass mobilization, World War I in particular, the mass mobilization of people, resources, drafting, gazillions of people into the armed forces, sending women to work in munitions factories, all this sort of stuff. That is what changed the architecture of voting and who got the right to vote. Because the determination was that you would get the vote based on your stake in society or the risks that you were taking to defend or protect that society. So in the case of mass mobilisation of mass conscription of young men. You were putting your life on the line to protect your country, and because you are putting your life on the line, you therefore should have the right to vote and decide who governs you. Now, then the vote around the time of the Vietnam War was reduced from 21 to 18. So these are the two sort of pivotal things. You're laying your life on the line during a time of mass mobilisation, therefore everyone should have the right to vote. If all men have the right to vote, then women are sacrificing their sons. They're going to work in factories for long hours. They too should have the right to vote because of the sacrifices they make. And then if we're going to draft kids to fight in the army at 18, and then because there was a draft in the US at the time, if we're going to draft kids at 18, then we have to lower the voting age from 21 to 18 because they're putting their lives on the line and they too should have the right to vote. And it's not an unreasonable consideration, by the way. If you're putting your life on the line, why not? You should get the right to change your government. But really it was those wars, Vietnam War included in the First World War, to a lesser extent the Second World War, again, the mass mobilisation of all the nation's resources. This changed the nature of who got the right to vote. And the idea of land owning or educational qualifications or literacy or whatever, this sort of went out the window. Well, that's not relevant now. We need to, give the vote to everybody over the age of 18. Now that today has completely changed the very concept of how democracy, whether you call it a republic or not, the right to vote is administered and who gets the right to say what. And ultimately it's led, I think, to democracy's downfall because the globalists perceive, why should we share power with those hoi polloi 2-bit bums? We don't have to share power with them. We're in fucking charge here and we don't have to share power. So we'll just undermine and negate democracy to either suit our purposes or we'll dispense with it and corrupt it entirely. But it no longer suits our purpose, and we don't see why we should have to tolerate it for a moment longer than we have. And that's where we're at today. But the arguments and the considerations of the founding fathers, I believe, are as valid today as they were then, because they look at who should vote and under what, who gets the right to choose the government. And really, if you look at the informed voter, literacy is far higher now than it was then. But if you look at the informed voter, then should any more than 50% of the population be voting? I'm not arguing for one or the other, by the way, putting the question out there. If you ask intellectuals like Noam Chomsky and the crowd that runs with him, they say a maximum. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. Now, I'm not saying Chomsky exactly said this, but they suggest that maybe 25% of the population is capable of understanding the issues and thus being capable of making an informed vote or casting an informed ballot. That would radically alter the architecture. But in order to save democracy, that is the right of people to vote and choose their government, then inevitably, in order to stop the globalists destroying democracy entirely or turning it into some little toy or plaything of theirs, it's going to come back to I think it's going to come back to the situation where we revisit this idea of who gets the right to vote and what should be the demarcation of who does and who doesn't get the right to vote, and that could bring democracy back to a functioning system, for the people. But that's only my view. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.